Chapter 1. The Girl in the Toxic Storm. The planet Vedra 6 was a graveyard of forgotten experiments, a place abandoned by every intelligent species in the galaxy, a world of ruin and poisoned air where even machines corroded faster than logic should allow. The very ground beneath its endless, jagged terrain bore the scars of past civilizations, from half-buried outposts to shattered research stations, all lost to the cruel grip of time and nature. Its sky churned with thick, noxious clouds of yellow-green toxicity, swirling in great tempests that could melt unprotected flesh in minutes. Wind howled across the landscape, carrying with it microscopic shards of metal and dust, each one coated in aerosolized acid, invisible to the eye but strong enough to etch deep scars into glass and steel. No one came here. No one should come here. The very idea of life thriving in this environment was absurd, a scientific impossibility. There was no clean water, no natural food, no breathable air. There were only the ruins, the storms, and the whispers of dead research projects left to rot in the silence of eternity. And yet, something was alive. Ethan Hayes had been preparing to leave when his ship's bioscanner flared unexpectedly to life. An erratic, faint pulse blinking red on his console, buried deep beneath the ruins of an ancient facility. His first reaction was disbelief. The scanner had to be malfunctioning, contaminated by radiation spikes, or distorted by storm interference. No living being should be down there, not on this planet. And yet, the signal persisted. A single, fragile heartbeat against the overwhelming nothingness of Vedra 6. He stared at the readout, his gut twisting in ways he didn't like. This wasn't his fight. He was here for salvage, nothing more. A quick in and out, grab what wasn't rusted beyond use, and get the hell out before the next acid storm rolled in and turned his ship into a pile of melting slag. But that pulse, faint and flickering, wouldn't stop blinking. Ethan exhaled slowly, dragging a hand through his dark, sweat-dampened hair before fastening his biomask into place. The smart thing to do was leave, pretend he never saw it. But smart had never really been his thing. The ramp of his ship lowered, and he stepped out into the wasteland of death. Even with the reinforced filtration system of his suit, he could feel the sting of the toxic air, the acidic atmosphere gnawing at the outer layers of his protective gear. His boots crunched against the brittle, ruined ground, sending small flurries of dust spiraling into the wind, each particle laced with microscopic death. Around him, jagged rock formations jutted from the earth like the ribs of some ancient, long-dead beast, their surfaces blackened and eroded by centuries of exposure to the storm's wrath. The ruins weren't far. A collapsed research station, half swallowed by the landscape. Its once grand metal framework now rusted and corroded, its walls crumbling under the constant assault of acid rain and winds that carried the echoes of long-dead scientists. The structure was barely standing, its skeletal remains half buried beneath layers of ash and sand, cables and supports protruding at odd angles like broken bones beneath torn flesh. It had been abandoned long ago, its purpose erased from the records of those who had created it. And yet, beneath all that decay and silence, something was alive. Ethan moved carefully, his pulse rifle strapped to his back, his wrist scanner blinking rapidly as he approached what had once been the entrance to the facility. A massive, gaping wound in the structure's frame greeted him, a collapsed doorway, torn open by time and decay. Inside, the darkness was almost complete, broken only by the occasional flicker of malfunctioning emergency lights, their pale blue glow casting eerie shadows against the walls. He activated the built-in flashlight on his suit, the beams slicing through the gloom, revealing the remnants of a world left behind. Debris littered the floor, scattered datapads, shattered glass tubes, rusted operating tables, all covered in a thick layer of grime and corrosion. The air inside was worse than outside, stale and heavy with a metallic tang. The remnants of long-evaporated chemicals still clinging to the surfaces like ghosts of past experiments. He followed the signal deeper, moving through the skeletal corridors, past half-collapsed rooms filled with the shattered remains of research equipment, past signs written in a language long since forgotten, past walls that bore the scars of something trying to claw its way out. And then he found her. At first, he thought she was already dead. She was slumped against the far wall of what must have once been a containment chamber, her body limp, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible, her skin, an unnatural shade of blue, was marred by deep, acidic burns, the fabric of her clothing half melted where the toxicity had eaten through it. Her long, dark hair was matted, strands clinging to her forehead, soaked with sweat. But it was the collar around her throat that sent a wave of cold anger through Ethan's chest. A containment collar. A high-tech restraint designed to suppress abilities used by slavers, corporate enforcers, and those who dealt in selling lives like commodities. Someone had left her here on purpose. Ethan crouched beside her, his gloved hand gently pressing against her neck, searching for a pulse. It was faint, so faint, but it was there. She was alive. "Hey," he murmured, his voice muffled behind the mask. He reached for the emergency biomask strapped to his belt, quickly fastening it over her mouth and nose, the filtration system hissing to life. "Stay with me." Her eyes flickered open golden, sharp, filled with something wild even in their dazed state. She didn't speak, her lips barely parting as a shuddering breath rasped through her lungs. She didn't trust him, but she didn't have a choice. Ethan wasted no time. He slipped his arms beneath her, lifting her carefully. She was light, far too light, as if starvation had hollowed her out long before the toxins ever touched her skin. Every step he took back toward his ship felt like a race against time, the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on him, the storm outside rising once more, howling like a beast awakening from its slumber. The wind had picked up, flinging shards of acidic rain across his visor, sizzling against the reinforced material. His ship's ramp was still open, the soft glow of interior lights spilling out onto the wasteland like a beacon. He pushed forward, one step at a time. The moment he crossed the threshold, the ship's airlock sealed behind him, cutting off the storm's furious scream. The pressure in the cabin stabilized, the sterile, filtered air flooding his lungs, a stark contrast to the hostile world outside. He laid her down on the medbay cot, his hands already moving to remove the damn containment collar locked around her throat. The mechanism was complex, designed to resist tampering, but Ethan had dealt with these before. A few precise tool manipulations, a bypass of the power circuit. The lock clicked. The collar fell away. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, her entire body tensed, and she gasped a deep, ragged breath as if she were breathing for the first time in years. Her golden eyes snapped open, locking onto him. And then, she whispered something in a language he didn't understand, her voice raw, weak, but filled with fury. Chapter 2. A Life No Longer Owned. The soft hum of the ship's life support systems was the only sound in the dimly lit medbay, a stark contrast to the howling fury of the storm that still raged beyond the reinforced hull of the Starborn. The sterile scent of disinfectants and recycled air replaced the metallic tang of the toxic atmosphere outside. Ethan Hayes stood beside the medical cot, arms crossed, his mind still trying to process what exactly he had just done. His ship was no stranger to taking in broken things, half-melted equipment, salvaged technology, the occasional fugitive running from debts they couldn't pay, but this was different. The alien woman he had rescued from the depths of Vedra's abandoned facility was no mere survivor of bad luck or circumstance. She was someone who had been left behind on purpose, someone discarded like a problem that needed erasing. And if that wasn't already enough reason to be on high alert, the damn containment collar he had removed from her neck confirmed exactly what kind of hell she had been enduring. That wasn't the kind of restraint someone willingly wore. It was a prison locked around the flesh of the unwanted, the enslaved, the dangerous. And now she was here, on his ship. She was breathing easier now, though each inhale still came with a shaky rasp, her lungs struggling to purge whatever toxins she had inhaled before he had found her. The biomask he had secured over her mouth was filtering the remaining impurities, steadily flushing the poisons from her bloodstream. He watched as her fingers twitched against the cot's surface, her muscles tensing in a way that spoke of deep instinct, the kind that came from years of expecting pain, of knowing that at any second, she might be forced to defend herself against the inevitable cruelty of the universe. Her eyes fluttered open again, those golden irises sharp and vivid, filled with something Ethan couldn't quite define. He expected confusion, maybe fear, maybe even gratitude. What he got instead was anger. She moved so fast he barely had time to react. One moment, she was lying there, weak and struggling to breathe. The next, her hand shot forward, fingers wrapping around his throat with surprising strength, her grip firm despite the state of her body. Ethan didn't fight back immediately. He had the training, the reflexes, the ability to break her hold and subdue her before she even had a chance to realize her mistake. But he didn't. Instead, he held still, staring into her eyes, letting her process the situation on her own terms. She wasn't trying to kill him. Not really. This wasn't an attack born of malice. This was a survival reflex. For a long, heavy second, she just breathed, her body trembling as she held him, as if trying to decide whether or not she could trust what her senses were telling her. Then, slowly, reluctantly, her grip loosened, and she let him go. Ethan took a small step back, rubbing his neck as he let out a slow exhale. That's one hell of a way to say thank you. She blinked, her golden eyes narrowing, studying him like he was some strange specimen in a lab. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was rough, hoarse from dehydration and whatever hell she had been through before he found her. Where am I? Ethan crossed his arms. Aboard my ship. You were dying back there. Figured I'd do something about it. Her gaze flickered toward the ceiling, the walls, the unfamiliar space around her. Then, slowly, she lifted a hand to her throat, fingers brushing against the spot where the containment collar had been locked around her flesh. The realization set in quickly, and when her eyes snapped back to him, they were filled with something dark and unreadable. You removed it, she whispered. Ethan nodded. Yeah. Figured you wouldn't be able to breathe properly with that thing still choking you. Her fingers curled into a tight fist, her breathing uneven, her entire frame shaking in a way that had nothing to do with toxins or exhaustion. There was emotion there, buried beneath layers of rigid control, something raw, something she refused to let surface. You shouldn't have done that, she muttered, her voice almost too low to hear. Ethan raised an eyebrow. I get that a lot. She didn't react to the sarcasm. Instead, she pushed herself up slowly, her arms visibly shaking under the effort. Every movement was deliberate, every twitch of her muscles calculated, as if she was testing whether or not her body was still her own. She didn't trust this moment, didn't trust him. And honestly, Ethan couldn't blame her. You got a name? He asked, keeping his voice casual, keeping his posture non-threatening. He knew better than to press too hard. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, with a slow breath, she finally spoke. Saya. Ethan gave a small nod. Saya. Good. You remember your own name. That's a start. She frowned. What do you mean? Ethan exhaled, leaning back against the counter. I don't know how long you were left down there, but with the kind of toxins you inhaled, memory loss wouldn't be surprising. Hallucinations, cognitive decay. I've seen what exposure to that kind of atmosphere can do to someone. I've pulled bodies out of places like that before. The fact that you're still alive is a damn miracle. Saya's expression remained unreadable, but her fingers curled slightly, as if gripping at something invisible. It wasn't a miracle, she murmured. It was punishment. That sent a sharp chill through Ethan's spine. Punishment. She had been left there on purpose. Who did this to you? He asked, his voice quieter now. Saya didn't answer immediately. Instead, she shifted, adjusting her posture, slowly pulling her legs over the side of the cot, her bare feet touching the cold metal floor. The movement was careful, deliberate, like she was relearning how to exist. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something fractured. My family, she said simply. Ethan stared at her. It took him a second to realize he had been holding his breath. Her family. They had left her there to die. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The ship hummed around them, the soft glow of the medbay monitors casting cold blue light across the walls. Ethan could feel the weight of this moment settling over them like a storm on the horizon. She had no one, no home, no allies. She had been left to rot on one of the deadliest planets in the sector, discarded like waste. And now? Now she was here, on his ship, in his care, whether he liked it or not. Saya's golden eyes locked onto him once more, sharp, questioning, wary. Why did you save me? Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck before shrugging. Seemed like the right thing to do. She studied him for a long time. Then, With a voice that carried both exhaustion and something Ethan couldn't quite place, she muttered. Then you are a fool. Maybe he was. But it was too late for regrets now. Chapter 3. The Price of Freedom. The ship's engines hummed softly beneath their feet, a steady rhythm that filled the silence between them. The recycled air smelled sterile, artificial, a far cry from the toxic wasteland of Vedra. 6. Yet to Saya, the atmosphere still felt just as suffocating. She sat on the edge of the cot in the med bay, her fingers gripping the edge of the metal frame as though anchoring herself to reality. Every inhale she took felt wrong, not because of the ship, not because of the unfamiliar surroundings, but because she was still breathing at all. She wasn't supposed to be. She had made peace with death the moment they left her there. And yet, she was still alive. Still here. Still sitting across from the human who had taken that fate away from her. Ethan Hayes. The man who had freed her. The man who should have left her to rot. He was watching her now, arms crossed over his chest, leaning against the counter like he wasn't standing in front of someone who could, and probably should, kill him for what he had done. His gaze wasn't one of fear, though not caution, not suspicion. It was something else. Something annoyingly patient. She hated that. You don't have to keep looking at me like I'm going to snap your neck, she muttered, her voice still hoarse, her throat raw from inhaling poison for far too long. Ethan let out a slow breath, shrugging slightly. You don't have to keep looking at me like I made a mistake by saving your life. Saya exhaled sharply through her nose. You did make a mistake. And yet, here we are, Ethan said, tilting his head slightly. You're breathing. You're alive. I'd say that's a pretty good outcome. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Then you clearly don't understand what you've done. Enlighten me. Saya clenched her jaw. She could still feel the phantom weight of the containment collar that had been locked around her throat, the way it had suppressed her body, crushed her into submission, turned her into nothing more than an object to be controlled. That collar had been a death sentence, but it had also been a mark of ownership, a brand that declared her fate was not her own. And now it was gone. And that meant someone, somewhere, was very unhappy about that. They won't let me live, she said, staring at him, willing him to understand what he had done. Whoever gave the order to leave me on that planet, they'll find out I survived. And they won't let that stand. Ethan didn't blink. Then we don't let them find you. Saya scoffed, shaking her head. You think it's that simple? I don't think anything is ever simple, Ethan admitted. But I also know that I don't regret what I did. And I'm not about to throw you out the airlock just because some people with a superiority complex think you belong to them. Saya went still. Something in his voice, something solid. Something real cut through the layers of numbness that had settled into her bones. He wasn't saying it to make her feel better. He wasn't saying it because he expected her to trust him. He was saying it because he meant it. And she didn't know what to do with that. Before she could respond, the ship's proximity alarm blared, sharp and sudden, cutting through the air like a warning bell before a storm. Ethan's head snapped up. That's not good. Saya's entire body tensed. The ship was moving. They were already off Vedra, 6, already away from that hellhole. If an alarm was going off now, it meant someone was here. Ethan was already moving, pushing off the counter and striding toward the cockpit. Saya followed, ignoring the protest of her still recovering body, her instincts screaming that this was exactly what she had warned him about. The moment they entered the cockpit, the main display flared to life, revealing what lay ahead of them in the vast emptiness of space. A ship. Not just any ship. A cruiser-class warship, its metallic hull gleaming with the insignia of the SYN Dominion. A mark Saya knew all too well. The mark of the family that had left her to die. Well shit, Ethan muttered. Saya's blood ran cold. They found me. The SYN Dominion cruiser loomed in the darkness, its weapons primed, but not yet firing, a silent promise of what was to come. A message request blinked on Ethan's screen, waiting, demanding to be answered. Ethan didn't sit down right away. Instead, he turned to Saya. This is your call. She frowned. What? This is your past catching up with you. You decide what happens next. She stared at him. She had expected him to take control, to make the decision for both of them, but instead, he was giving it to her. That wasn't how people like him usually acted. It wasn't how people treated her. For a moment, she considered telling him to run, to try to escape. But no. The SYN Dominion wasn't sending just any ship. That cruiser had come for one reason: to reclaim what they thought was theirs. And she was not theirs. Not anymore. Answer it, she said, her voice steel. Ethan pressed a button. The screen flickered, revealing a holographic figure. A woman dressed in the ornate uniform of the Dominion. Her silver hair perfectly arranged, her expression cool, emotionless. Saya felt her breath catch in her throat. Her sister. Saya, the woman said smoothly, as if addressing a wayward child. I was hoping the reports were wrong. But it seems you are alive after all. Saya said nothing. The woman's gaze flicked to Ethan, and there was barely a hint of interest in her eyes. I see you've made company. Ethan leaned against the console. Yeah, hi. Not a fan of the whole abandoning family members on death planets thing you guys have going on. A flicker of amusement touched the woman's lips. You misunderstand. Saya was never abandoned. She was sentenced. Ethan's hands curled into fists, but he stayed silent, letting Saya speak for herself. She lifted her chin, her voice cold. You don't get to decide what I am anymore. Her sister sighed, as if disappointed. You are property, Saya. Always have been. You exist to serve, and now that you have been recovered, you will return. The alternative is unacceptable. Saya exhaled slowly. Then, in a voice filled with quiet defiance, she said, No. Her sister's eyes darkened. Then you leave us no choice. The transmission cut, and the cruiser opened fire. Ethan slammed his hand on the controls. Brace. The Starborn twisted violently as plasma blasts streaked toward them, shields flaring under the impact. Alarms blared. Saya grabbed onto the console, forcing herself to stay steady as Ethan threw the ship into evasive maneuvers, dodging between bursts of lethal energy. Hang on, princess. Ethan called over the chaos. I hope you're ready to fight for that freedom of yours. Saya gritted her teeth, her pulse hammering. I always was. Chapter 4. A Battle for Freedom. The Starborn twisted violently as another plasma barrage from the SYN Dominion cruiser streaked past, narrowly missing the ship's hull. Alarms screamed across the cockpit, the red glow of warning lights bathing everything in an urgent haze. Saya's hands gripped the edges of the console, her breath coming in steady but controlled intervals, her body instinctively bracing for the next impact. Ethan Hayes was at the controls, fingers flying across the console as he pushed the ship far beyond its designed limits, twisting it into evasive maneuvers that would have torn apart a lesser vessel. The cruiser was relentless, a machine of war built to overwhelm, not to chase. It didn't have to be fast, just had to keep firing until nothing was left but debris. And that meant Ethan and Saya weren't going to win a fight head-on. They had to outthink it. Another blast rocked the ship, and Ethan cursed under his breath, his knuckles white against the throttle controls. That was too damn close. Shields are down to 20%. If we take another direct hit, we're done. Saya's mind worked faster than her body, calculating every possibility, every move left to them. She had spent her life inside SYN Dominion warships, knew how they thought, how they operated. Her sister wasn't just attacking randomly. This was pressure tactics, a slow, calculated push to corral them, to force them into a dead end. And Saya refused to let that happen. They're not trying to destroy us, she said, her voice sharp, certain. Ethan gave her a look. Could have fooled me. Saya shook her head. If they wanted us dead, they would have hit us with a disruptor pulse and ended this already. No, this is a containment maneuver. They want us crippled, not destroyed. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Why? Saya's jaw clenched. Because they want me alive. Ethan was silent for half a second. Then, in a tone that was far too calm for their current situation, he said, well, that's a damn shame. Because they're not getting what they want. Another blast rocked the ship, and Saya's mind snapped into action. Turn toward the storm, she barked. Ethan blinked. What storm? She pointed to the starboard display, where a massive ion storm was brewing just beyond the gravitational pull of a nearby moon. Flashes of electrical energy surged through the swirling mass of charged plasma, a violent tempest of radiation and lightning that no ship in its right mind would enter. Ethan took one look at it and let out a short, incredulous laugh. You're insane. They won't follow us, Saya insisted. They can't. That storm will tear apart anything bigger than a Scout-class ship. Yeah, I got that. Problem is, we're not much bigger than a Scout-class ship. We'll survive. They won't. For a second, Ethan looked like he was about to argue. Then, with a muttered curse, he slammed the controls forward, angling the ship toward the raging vortex of cosmic death. I swear, if we die, I'm haunting you in the afterlife, he shouted over the roar of the engines. Saya didn't answer. She was too focused on watching the cruiser's movements, waiting for the exact moment when they would realize what she was doing. They had seconds. Then, the cruiser's weapons ceased fire. Saya's lips curved into a smile of cold satisfaction. There it is, she murmured. What? Ethan demanded. They're hesitating. And just as she predicted, the massive warship began slowing, adjusting its trajectory, keeping its distance from the storm's outer edge. Ethan let out a breath of relief until his sensors flared to life again. Bad news, Princess. They're deploying fighters. Saya clenched her jaw. Of course they were. The Starborn was fast, agile, but against multiple strike-class interceptors, they wouldn't last long. Unless... She turned sharply to Ethan. How quickly can you dump the reactor core? Ethan nearly choked. You want me to what? Dump the core and vent the plasma conduit, Saya said, her voice rising as the first wave of pursuing fighters closed in behind them. The explosion will create an EMP surge. We can use it to knock out their targeting systems and disappear into the storm. Ethan gaped at her. That's the most reckless, suicidal plan I've ever heard. Another blaster bolt slammed into their rear shields, sending a shower of sparks through the cockpit. Doing it! Ethan shouted, flipping a series of emergency overrides faster than most engineers would have thought possible. Saya braced herself. The moment the reactor core detached from the ship's main power grid, a violent shockwave of energy erupted behind them, the bright blue explosion flaring against the void of space like a dying star. The Dominion fighters never saw it coming. The surge hit their systems all at once, frying navigation panels, sending them spiraling off course as their pilots fought desperately to regain control. And the Starborn? It vanished into the storm. The turbulence inside the ion storm was relentless. Every flash of electricity outside sent violent tremors through the ship's hull, making every movement feel like they were on the verge of being torn apart. The emergency power flickered as Ethan struggled to keep them from spinning out of control, while Saya worked frantically to reroute auxiliary systems just to keep the ship breathable. For what felt like an eternity, they fought against the storm's rage. And then, silence. The ship stabilized, the shaking subsiding to a gentle hum. The storm still raged outside, but they had found a calm pocket within its chaos, a rare haven where they could breathe again. Saya slumped back in her seat, exhaling slowly. Ethan let out a hollow laugh. I can't believe that worked. Saya tilted her head toward him. You doubted me? Yes, completely. She huffed, closing her eyes for a brief moment. The weight of everything settled over her, the escape, the battle, the finality of what she had just done. There was no going back. Her family, the Dominion, the world she had once belonged to, it was gone. For the first time in her life, she was truly free. So what now? Ethan asked. She opened her eyes. And for the first time, she allowed herself to smile. Now, we live.